Let's get further insights on the Russian-Ukraine war as global affairs analyst Sam Fati, who's joining me live via Zoom from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Fati. It's 19 days now since the invasion. Russian-Ukrainian representatives have resumed talks in a bid to end weeks of fighting. But this is as Russia continues to pound Kyiv. What progress do you think has been made so far to resolve this crisis?
I think one thing that they're trying to do is the talks. Now, the talks are holding, but the question is, are they gaining any meaningful steps towards ending this conflict? The ceasefires are not being totally respected and adhered to. And I do see why also NATO countries are not going to impose a no-fly zone, because they do not want any further escalation of the war. However, I know there are other arms supplies that have been streamed across the border from Europe into Ukraine to Kyiv for them to defend themselves. And NATO has warned Russia that if their convoy is attacked, they will retaliate. Now, that is not as bad as an escalation it will be if a no-fly zone is imposed. And if a no-fly zone is imposed, it means that it has to be enforced. The question is who would enforce it. If NATO nations are enforcing it, that's the ultimate escalation, and they're trying to avoid that by all means necessary right now.
Looking at the possibility of escalation of this crisis, this Sunday's airstrike on the military base near the Polish border has brought the war dangerously close to, NATO's doorstep. Then there is a killing of an American journalist and filmmaker and another injured. Do you think Russia is taking this war too far and may drag NATO into this war eventually?
The unfortunate truth about war is that we have the Geneva Convention. There are other rules that we know we must apply when it comes to war. But when conflict is occurred and there are assaults on cities and cities are under siege, I mean, bullets and bombs do not know who is a journalist or who is a civilian. Generally, these are done very indiscriminately. War crimes are committed during war, whether it is in Africa, whether it is in Europe, or it is in Syria, or somewhere in the Middle East. So regardless of where you are, these war crimes are committed. Now, if it's powerful countries that are conducting this war, it becomes very difficult to hold them responsible when it comes to international law. I mean, historically, we have seen in the U.S. soldiers and contractors commit war crimes. You have some that have been prosecuted, but you have a lot of them too that have not been prosecuted. We are seeing the same thing Russia is conducting indiscriminately and without rumors or regrets in Ukraine. And so they feel that nobody is also going to hold them responsible. Now, the question is, will Russia hold any general or any soldier responsible for any war crimes after the fact? It could happen. But again, maybe very junior soldiers, just like in any other country, are going to take the fall for it, not those that are truly responsible for this. Now, the death or the killing of a journalist during the war is very unfortunate. But again, as reporters, it is the kind of risk that we take when we go into such territory, especially when you have an adversary that don't have no respect for human rights at all. And we can see that the onslaught that Vladimir Putin and his army is taking. I mean, even when civilians are trying to use the agreed safe corridors to leave their cities, they have been bombarded, they have been shot at, and they have been killed. So the crimes are there, it is obvious, and the killing of the journalist Renaud is a very good example of how indiscriminate the Russians have been acting in Ukraine.
Well, let's look at what China says. I read earlier that China says the claim by U.S. officials that Russia asked Beijing to provide it with military assistance in Ukraine is disinformation. Recent weeks we've been talking about China's body language to, this Russia-Ukrainian war, where China, even on its own state media, referred to the invasion as special operation. The same way Russia is also referring it in its own country and states media. Do you see, what's your reaction to this? China saying that that we are providing with ammunition is disinformation.
Well, China is trying to sound like they don't want to take sides. When we look at the votes at the United Nations Security Council and the vote by the General Assembly, they abstained. So China is trying to make sure that they do not face any sort of secondary sanctions towards any of their industries. So they're trying to tread very carefully, but in a rather hypocritical way. However, we know very well that the economic and financial sanctions that Russia is facing, even though China is going to be supported, especially when it comes to processing their bank payment, it's not enough. It's not going to suffice for them. So while China is trying to tread carefully, and I would say in a rather hypocritical way again, the fact is that China supports Russia.
Yeah.
China is Russia's biggest ally when it comes to this war. Of course, you have other smaller nations like Belarus and others, but for them to at least help keep their economy afloat, China is going to be their biggest supporter, and they are supporting Russia. Now, just like any diplomatic maneuver, they do not stand out there and say this so openly and so clearly. And Russia, for example, considers Ukraine as part of Russia, as a province of Russia. Now, they don't make this apparent and they don't say this as often as China says it when it comes to Taiwan. So China is trying to be careful as they try to measure what their next step towards Taiwan is. This is part of their one China policy. So they are not going to openly say this is an invasion, it is wrong. They see this as, hey, this is like a sort of a special military operation where they are trying to bring what they consider a province of Russia as part of Russia. What can we learn from this? They are looking at the international reactions. They are looking at what the world is doing, and then they are going to strategize from there. So they cannot call it an invasion, and they will not call it an invasion at their own selfish interest. Russia, though, has to be very careful because diplomatically and in international affairs, anybody would realize that, even an amateur would realize and know that China is a very self-vested and very self-interested country.
Right, we'll continue to monitor these developments, especially with the talks that is ongoing, and see where it's going to lead, because the foreign minister for Ukraine is already saying that they're more than likely to achieve make meaningful achievements at the end of the talks. Thank you very kindly, Sam Fati, Global Affairs Analyst. Thank you so much for your insight.
My pleasure.